Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the next session. Delighted to see you all here again. And a very, very warm welcome to my colleague, Edgar Meyer, who's got a really interesting presentation for us. And I love the title, Edgar, Navigating the Forces of Change, Supporting Faculty, Success and Failure in the Transition to Online Teaching and Assessment During a Crisis. So it's the COVID-19 journey of Leeds University Business School. Over to you, and I will be monitoring the questions in the chat bar, so please, colleagues, do ask some interesting questions so we can keep the conversation going. Over to you, Edgar.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you very much for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this talk. I think this talk itself is a representation of what, for many of us, the last 12, 18 months were like, that we are reflecting on our journeys and our experiences via technological means. And I'm sure this will be a sort of thread throughout, and it will most definitely be a thread throughout this presentation. Please, my aim is to speak for about 15 minutes or so, and hopefully we can then have a conversation around that. I'm sure I can learn as much from anyone that is part of this conversation. And I'm just sharing my perspective on how I think we, as a business school, went through this rather surprising journey. I want to also put a disclaimer out there in saying is that I was in a position where I started my role at Leeds on the 1st of April in 2020, i.e. I literally joined the week that the lockdown became proper. And my first role as a deputy dean was de facto to begin the crisis management aspect of what does that mean for us as an organization. There are a number of personal challenges thus in terms of not having really met many colleagues prior to that, not having been at the place that you see behind me in that picture, and maybe that is reflected as part of this conversation. I think it also provides an interesting way of understanding where some of the challenges potentially are, where some of the opportunities are, as I was not necessarily as embedded in some of the realities of day-to-day life. So please keep that in mind when I share what I'm sharing with you. It is a personal reflection on the journey that we had. So if I may start off with this idea of surprise and shock. There was, for many of us, a notion that something is not quite right already at the beginning of January of last year. I personally found myself traveling to Taiwan and Japan in early January in 2020 and knew something was going on because mutterings were there. But really for us, when the announcement came in the week 17th of March that from the 23rd of March, we are in a national lockdown that no one quite knew what it was going to look like and we haven't really experienced, was met by many with surprise and shock because we never quite thought it would hit us in the same way. And I think this is really important because I think it is what drove many of us to react much quicker than universities usually react to various things. We are large beasts, and change is not something that comes easily to our types of organization. But I think this shock, this surprise in the middle of an academic year was something, I think, that accelerated much of the change that we've been talking about and hearing about over the last few months, but I'm sure is also a thread for today. I think the second thing to say in terms of the context in which I am presenting this is that Leeds University had some experience in delivering and providing digital and online education, both at the university level, but also at the business school level. We have run very successfully a level 7 apprenticeship program that was fully online. We have very successfully flipped a number of large modules with implementing very sophisticated in-classroom technology, and really were already on a journey to begin to think about what a digital education or digitally enhanced education will look like. And I think it is important because I think all of us started this journey at slightly different points along that spectrum of moving to digital education and digital education delivery. And that links me to the third picture on that slide, and that is vision, strategy, and innovation. And I think that is linked to the fact that we've had some exposure and some experience, both at the university and at the school level, in that there was a vision for what digital can do within the education space. I hasten to say, probably not to this extent that quickly and all of it online. But there was a sense of a travel of direct or traveling in a certain direction. And the innovation aspect is that we were very lucky and are very lucky in that we have a fantastic enhancement and innovation team that has supported us with digital tools throughout our journey over the last 5 years or more to really begin to embed digital technology as part of our day-to-day education delivery. That team has become, and the innovativeness of this team was pivotal in us pivoting. Sorry, no pun intended. But it was very much around having that local support and that spirit of innovation and that spirit of experience, but also that spirit of a vision that supported us quite significantly around that. But first things first. Here we are. Imagine. It is the 24th of March. I'm sure we all remember. I'm starting my job a week early because I couldn't finish my old job because it was locked down. We had to pivot quickly. We had to begin to think about how are we continuing the delivery of our education to our existing students. For many of us in business schools, that is our undergraduate population, which is largely home UK students with some international students, but it is also our postgraduate taught students who many of them are traveling to the UK to study for 1 year. And one of the things we had to ask ourselves is, what does good education in that space look like? Clearly, it can't be a fully online program that we would normally spend 6 months developing and presenting. We don't have 6 months. We're going to have to deliver some education next week, the week after, next month, etc. So our first step was to begin to think about and define what does good look like. And again, our experience, our fantastic innovative team, and the spirit of knowing that this was anyway something we're going to possibly explore meant that we were fairly quickly in a place of saying, here are some guidelines. This is what you ought to be able to develop within the time frame that you have. Here is a model of how you could flip your teaching and your learning relatively efficiently. But more importantly, good is also that the student experience is somewhat coherent, so that not one academic or member of faculty is delivering something all via live Zoom, and the other one is pre-recording everything via their mobile phone home camera, and it feels like some ride on a seaside with lots of wobbly around. So for us, it was really, really important to set some boundaries around what we think good is within that space. Now, fast forward a couple of months, we then had to think about how do we do this for a new academic year, a new set of students coming in, where the forgiveness of the suddenness and the surprise probably has waned already, and that the expectation is that we, as large, good educational institutions that do research, will have adapted. So good took a different shape. The definition of what good was moved along with the time period in which we had to deliver education in that format. And that meant more descriptors around how we as an organization might want to present our learning. The disciplinary flexibility you need to build in a very large business school that services many different subject areas, because clearly delivering a highly quantitative module in decision making is going to look very different than a course around leadership or human resource management practices. So it's about understanding the complexity of delivery models and how these can be adapted and what good means within different subject areas. And of course, being competitive organizations, we also had to look what good is elsewhere, and therefore benchmark ourselves. So it was very important to not necessarily try to compete and make Leeds, the Leeds experience, and continue that Leeds experience, but also understand where we are sitting amongst the pack of business schools that are delivering that. We also had to think about what is needed to develop good quickly. This graph I've shown there that many of you will have seen on that text is one of my favorite little things to show when people are saying, we have to do something really, really quickly and it has to be top of the crop. Well, you can have 3 kinds of service. This is borrowed from a marketing perspective. You can have good, cheap, and fast, and you can pick any 2. Good and cheap won't be fast, fast and good won't be cheap, and cheap and fast won't be good. So for us, it was really important to think about what is it that we can do within the resource implications that we have. And resource implication here is not solely money. Resource implication is time. Faculty time is valuable. Faculty time is rare. Our faculty has to do research. Our faculty has planned and is planning to deliver education. So pivoting towards a different model of delivering meant, what are we going to do with the faculty time we have, or the faculty time we don't have? What has to go? What has to stay? Where can we supplement? What are the timelines for these sorts of things? So we can't expect colleagues to work 24/7 for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. And these are really hard decisions because we know we're going to have to deliver to our student body. We want to deliver the education. We want to deliver the research, but we have to do this within the envelopes. And our journey was very much one of consultation and collaboration. We worked closely with our divisions. We worked closely with the various stakeholders around that to really begin to discuss what that looks like. And here, really, just to sort of say that the dependencies on that decision were the stakeholder management. It was really very much around how we worked with our heads of departments and heads of division, heads of subject groups, how we work with program leads to make decision at program level to support our course leaders. Thinking about the equity of experience of our students, so that not some students only have recorded, others have live sessions, but really begin to align that experience to the Leeds experience as we would normally expect a Leeds experience. And thinking about the quality assurance processes. Within the UK, that is vitally important. And we weren't going to compromise on the assessment rigorousness, on our professional body requirements to deliver certain aspects. So this was a complex, I always think it would be wonderful case studies for teaching stakeholder management mapping, who to influence, who to keep informed, where power sits, and really beginning to understand the dynamics of an organization. And for me, this was highly insightful because I could very quickly begin to work with many, many colleagues across the organization, which probably would have taken me much longer in starting my new role. We also needed to look very quickly at what needed to be in place. And one of the most important aspects, and we're still talking about this, is what training for faculty and students is available. Many of you will be aware, we're talking a lot about Generation Z and their ability to be digital natives. But being digital natives on Instagram or TikTok or Twitter is very different to engaging them in a learning experience online, where a conversation, a relationship building takes on a very different nature. So again, our experience shone through, and that the University of Leeds already had material out there to support individuals of beginning the transition to online and digital learning. But it was also around how we can harness the experience, the expertise, and the passion of many of our colleagues to adopt digital technology and share that very, very quickly, remotely. Usually we would get them into a room in a brown bag paper lunch sort of session and say, hey, this is what we've been doing. Why don't you adopt this? No longer possible. We now had to do this using Zoom, Teams, etc. I'm going to come to the level of technology in a moment. So it was really, really fascinating to observe how a community can come together and can share, and actually where all of a sudden different impetuses or impetite came from. Some of our younger colleagues who played a lot with digital technology in their teaching, all of a sudden were catapulted into the center of attention within divisions and subject groups because they had expertise that they could share and other people could leverage. It was well-being and support for faculty and students that were in isolation. That is really important. We had to continuously remind ourselves, some people are sitting alone at home. I know we are laughing at the funny moments where a child might walk in or a cat walks over the keyboard. I'm one of those people who ended up with a lockdown puppy. But there are some people, and I wrote some blog posts elsewhere around that because I lead much of the equality and diversity and inclusion initiatives, is some people sit alone, have very little access, have to shield. And we really needed to begin to think about how we are being inclusive in a very different format, in a very different mode. And of course, tech support. We all believe, we work in academia, we're used to high-speed internet. Well, We all found out very quickly high-speed internet does not cover every postcode or every zip code. And really beginning to understand, more importantly also, the accessibility of some of our online education for our students. So what about loan schemes for dongled internet? What about laptops that students can actually access? What about microphones? What about cameras? What about high-speed computing if you are away and you still have to do research? So some fascinating challenges that probably without the pandemic would have not surfaced as quickly as soon, and really started to challenge some of the realities in which we operate. So moving on to the challenges, therefore, is, and that first picture, that mind map is around Blackboard, Paddlepad, Miro, Zoom, Teams, Blackboard Ultra. All of a sudden, we realized we are operating within a minefield of technology, some of which is accessible one way, but not another. Some is accessible in some countries, not in other countries. Some works really well in small groups, others don't like that. But because we never had to consistently apply it, there was a lot of local choice. But when you then do this at an organizational level, even if it's solely at a business school level, and we are quite a big business school with about 5,500, 6,000 students and 300 or so staff, that causes some real challenges in terms of alignment, in terms of tech support, in terms of all of these kind of aspects. It's about best practice. It comes back to the definition of good, and I love my Dilbert comics around, we will be adopting best practice in our industry. If everyone is doing it, isn't it mediocrity? So it's that comparison. What sets us apart? Where can we be still innovative using Zoom, using all of these other technologies? And do we really want to benchmark ourselves there or there? And that's been some interesting and fascinating conversations around where we're at, which leads me to the who wants to change versus who wants to change. Lots of people recognize this, like, yes, we need to change, we need to adapt, we need to do this, we need to adopt this technology, or we need to engage pedagogically within that kind of thing. And when we then said, okay, so here, learn this. Well, I haven't got time to learn this. I'm really used to this, and I'm going to stick using this, because why would I do something else? Because you're asking all of these things of me. And these are valid arguments, but beginning to balance these kind of different perspectives and those drives been one of the big challenges that I quite relished and enjoyed, but really one that we are now beginning to come out of and have constructive conversations around what was good, what was bad, and what can we keep. And of course, time, because all of this was time sensitive. Both as we were delivering out the 1920 years, but as we're moving into 2021, it became clear we have to be better from September, October in 2020. So my last slide really is then much more about, so what next then? With all of this experience, we can go in typical organizational fashion and go, yeah, let's do a post-mortem, shelve that, and let's think about where we go next. Or we can do and say, what is worth keeping? I'm using this baby and bathwater metaphor, which I found out, being German, I actually found out it comes from a German saying, which I never knew. But looking at this picture, are we pivoting straight back now that we can, or potentially can do that with the vaccines rolling out and less restrictions in the UK? Or are we staying all online? Or are we doing something in between, and which bits work? And that leads me to this, what is innovative pedagogy? It is different. Yeah. And whilst some of it worked really well in a quick adaptation, does it work longer term? What is the experience of our students? What else haven't we delivered in this time that we need to bring back? And of course, and I loved finding that picture, we're getting on the online learning bus. We've been on this bus anyhow, but we got more people on that bus now. And we're probably going to drive this a little more, a little faster across a variety of platforms, because we now have experience. It now is no longer a scary conversation going to colleagues and saying, hey, how about we're going to deliver and develop some really cool online learning resources, CPD, MOOCs, professional development, credit bearing, stackable, because people are not so afraid of this anymore. When I started this journey many years ago, getting engaged in online, trying to convince people that this is a way, that this is a thing, was a very difficult conversation. The conversation has changed, which meant more people can get on that online learning bus. And I'm delighted with that, because I think it has a future. It will never replace an on-campus experience, but our on-campus experience will change too. I think the digital transformation is live and real, and probably will remain with us as a result of that. So I hope these were just some interesting things that resonated with some of you. I saw Lynn nodding now and then, and happy to answer any questions. I try to keep it sort of lightened things, but I think we have some time for a couple of questions maybe. Thank you all very much.
And thank you very much, Edgar. That was fascinating. I love the graphics, by the way. They were really good, really inventive, nice. We have got a couple of questions actually on the question answer bar, and I think it's probably best if I just ask them. So the first one's from Irina. What do you consider as the main difficulties for this teaching staff and the students? Are there any bottlenecks, any conflicts? Have you had complaints from both sides? What kind of experiences have you had?
Fantastic question. Yes, and yes to all of these things. Of course, there is, I think, what I referred to in terms of the expectation management, but also the support that we provide both to our faculty, but also our students is very important. Assuming that students find accessing online learning easy, I think is a false assumption or false sense of security, just because they're happy with a smartphone and filming themselves on TikTok or others on TikTok or Instagram. And online learning and engaging with online learning is a different format. It's not rolling up in a seminar room, sitting there and being poked to potentially contribute. That form of engagement is very different. And I think that was certainly one of the things we learned very quickly, and thank goodness we're able to produce some nice short videos with our dean, so associate dean in education, myself, our executive dean, to really kind of harness that. Faculty, the challenge was very much around time and enabling them to think more than just mirroring what they're doing in the classroom. So I feel lucky and privileged in that I have a PhD student who researches exactly that. So I was hopefully able to support some of the conversations around that. It is different, and I know it's the time that it takes to do that. And the bottleneck there for them becomes time. And I think much of the resource that we usually would put into online development by getting someone into a studio or getting someone to help script what it would look like, people had to do remotely at home by themselves, having never done it before, going through yet another web page describing how to do it, going through yet another video showing them how they might want to record things. So I think that was where the bottleneck are. I think going forward, it's much more about that shifting of pedagogy.
Okay, thank you. We've also got a question from Lena that kind of builds on that, and it's about what wellbeing support did you provide to staff and students, to help them with that?
Great question. And I think this is something where we probably have learned the most in a sense of community building and what worked and didn't. And there you learned very quickly what didn't work. So I don't think we all got it perfect there. So of course, our services for students and staff that were about serious mental health challenges were still available, and we pivoted them online very, very quickly. But it was then beginning to think about, are we hosting big events online where people can drop in? What about local level engagement, coffee meetings, coffee mornings, quizzes, you name it, we've done it. Other initiatives were, text someone once a day that sits alone, and it was actually these local, very personal bits that really helped. I think what we put on as a school was well intended and was perceived as being well intended, but probably didn't reach necessarily those that really needed it to reach. And I think once we were able to release that within to the local level, I think that is when it really took hold.
Those human interactions again. Zareen's got an interesting question about how you dealt with online assessments. It's a big one.
It is, and I'm there's a session later where some colleagues that I worked with, just whilst I was finishing my old role and beginning my new one from Imperial College, will probably give you a very different answer around that, because different organization approached this very differently, and I really have a view from quite two opposing ends. One where there was a sense of we're sticking to what we've planned in the first year and then adapting. In Leeds University, we adopted a plan where we moved away from traditional examinations unless they were necessary for the recognition with professional bodies, which was really positive in some ways, in that it helped us with the conversations around how do we assess for learning. A conversation that I'm sure many of us in universities have been trying to have over many years, but never really had a reason to change, because we could host exams in a large hall and we could host various ways of assessing that we couldn't host anymore. And that was really interesting. I think supporting some colleagues around thinking how they do presentation or pitches in a format was brilliant, and we kept much of that. And for certainly the new academic year in 2020, 2021, so the one we're currently in, we certainly adapted a little around that. I think one of the things is important here to recognize it's different for many organizations, depending how much it's driven by an organizational approach versus a local approach. We like to align simply to ensure that our quality assurance processes make sense and that there's a fairness across the student body, because we host a lot of joint programs, and it wouldn't be great for students to have one experience in one faculty and another experience in another faculty.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time. We've got 5 minutes, but there are two really interesting questions for you.
I'll try to be shorter.
No, not at all. I think it's just it's the presentations generated some really interesting questions. So Rajiv is asking whether you expect to see universities, schools collaborate with each other in the online space, and if so, how? And we've got a further question from Byumba, who's asking, how has your experience as regards provision of library and information services at Leeds been? And I suspect after that, Edgar, we won't have any space for any other questions.
I'll be very quick. To collaborate is a yes. I think it's a brilliant opportunity, particularly around short courses and CPD and expertise. I think there's huge potential that now that we have pivoted and have some material, to actually, rather than creating local material around niche subjects, collaborating with organizations that have that niche subject and making this accessible is brilliant. I don't think it will happen in core content as easily, but certainly in optional and elective content and in executive education and CPD. I think is where that goes. So that's the first question. The second question around library support, I think it's really interesting, and I think this is where where are we on that journey and on the experience really comes to the fore. We've already been at the very digital end of library provision. So we had moved most of our books to ebooks anyhow, even though that some of the publishers were more challenging than others, but on the whole, that was a move that we've done for a very long time, making the library much more of a learning resource center rather than a book storage. And I think that helped us in that we had digital reading list tools available already that were integrated. So this was probably the least of our problems. Thank goodness, because it ensured some consistency on that level. But I'm sure different places were at different journeys in that particular thing. Yeah, so that's where we were at in that.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We're getting lots of positive comments on the chat bar in the question and answers. So a really, really stimulating discussion. So thank you very much indeed, Edgar, and a big clap from all of us.
Thank you all very much for joining and listening. It's been great.